He was just a cub, small, shivering, and lost beneath the howling winds of Mount Ashmore. The storm had taken his mother. The forest offered no comfort, and now glowing yellow eyes closed in from the shadows. Wolves, a dozen of them, teeth bared, no escape, no hope. But then something ancient stirred among the trees, a sound like thunder, a force of nature in the shape of a bear, massive scarred, silent. And in that moment, when fear turned to silence and silence to surrender, came a miracle, a protector, a teacher, a legend. This is not just a story of survival. It is the making of a guardian, the rise of the unexpected, and the bond that would change not only one young cub's fate, but the future of an entire mountain. Ashmore Hollow, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of the North Carolina, was a town that disappeared into the wilderness once the fog rolled in. The townsfolk liked it that way. And when the autumn winds swept through the ridgelines, the forest roared with an ancient breath that reminded even the bravest of hikers not to wander too far. That night, as the sun dipped beneath the tree-crusted hills, a storm unlike any seen in years took hold of Mount Ashmore. The clouds came fast, a churning bruise of gray and black that swallowed the last of the twilight. The wind howled with a mournful rage, ripping through pine branches and scattering leaves like the ghosts of autumn past. Lightning cracked the sky in jagged silver veins. Thunder rolled down the slopes, shaking the bones of the mountain. In the middle of that chaos, a small black bear cub stumbled across the muddy forest floor. His name was Theo. He was barely 6 months old, his fur still soft and patchy with shades of brown and black. His paws were large for his frame, always tripping over roots and stones, and his ears twitched nervously at every sound. His eyes, a rich amber, were wide with fear as he called out for the one creature he trusted in the world. Mom? His mother. Juniper was a powerful female black bear known for her fierce devotion. Strong and broad-shouldered, with a tear-shaped scar above her left eye from an old hunter's trap, she had protected Theo from the dangers of the wild with a force that bordered on divine. But even she couldn't fight a falling tree. They had been foraging by a stream swollen with rain, the smell of wet fish and pine sap sharp in the air. Juniper had turned her head to sniff the wind, just as a bolt of lightning split the sky. In the next breath, a pine tree, old, brittle, worn hollow from years of rot, crashed between them. The ground shuddered. Theo had been thrown backward down a slope, sliding in the mud, and by the time he found his feet, Juniper was gone. No growl, no warning, no goodbye. Now. Theo crouched beneath the gnarled roots of a lightning-struck oak, its bark scorched and steaming. Rain poured from the sky in sheets cold and relentless, soaking his coat and chilling his small frame to the bone. He didn't know which direction was home, or even if his mother was alive. All he knew was the forest no longer smelled familiar. It smelled like danger. His small body trembled as he listened. The wind screamed, branches snapped, and beneath it all, something else. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A low rustle, then another, measured, deliberate. Theo's breath caught his ears perked. He peeked from beneath the roots and saw them, eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark yellow. Watching predators. The wolves had found him. They came in silence as the deadliest hunters do, 6 at first emerging like phantoms from the underbrush. Their fur slick with rain, their lean bodies moving in concert. At the center was the largest of them, a gray wolf with thick matted fur and a scar that ran from above his eye down to his jaw. His name was Fang. Fang was known across the forest, though Theo had never seen him before. Even the older animals whispered his name. Ruthless, tactical. A predator who never killed out of need but out of dominion. His pack hunted not just for food, but for territory. Ferrul Fang stepped forward, his golden eyes narrowing. He didn't growl, he didn't need to. The other wolves fanned out, forming a semicircle around Theo. There was no escape. Theo backed deeper under the oak paws, digging into wet earth. His heart pounded. He was small, alone, helpless. He could barely climb, let alone run. He thought of his mother. He thought of the warmth of her fur, the sound of her breath as she slept beside him. He let out a whimper. Fang's ears twitched. That was all the signal the pack needed. Muscles tensed, bodies coiled, they lunged. Theo screamed and braced for the pain. And that's when the roar came. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't thunder. It was something older, something bigger, something furious. The ground shook as a shadow tore through the underbrush. A massive shape burst from the forest, slamming into the wolves. With the force of a rock slide, a paw the size of a dinner plate struck the nearest wolf mid-leap, sending it sprawling with a pained yelp. Theo could barely register what was happening. The air was suddenly thick with the scent of grisly, earthy musky, undeniable. He looked up and saw him. The bear was enormous, at least 3 times the size of Juniper. His fur was slate gray with streaks of silver running down his back, as if the mountain itself had etched its colors into him. Scars marked his flanks, silent stories of battles long past. His eyes were cold, dark, ancient, and unyielding. This was Mason. Mason was a grizzly who had not been seen near human settlements for over a decade. Some said he'd once fought off 2 mountain lions at once. Others whispered he'd saved a trapped elk calf from drowning, only to vanish without trace. He was legend, he was mystery, and he was terrifying. But now he stood between Theo and the wolves, like a stone wall against a river. Fang skidded to a stop. His snarl faltered. Mason didn't growl. He didn't charge. He just stared, daring them. The pack hesitated. Another wolf whimpered and backed away. The others followed, tails low. Only Fang remained, his lip curled, the scar on his muzzle twitching. Mason took a single step forward. Fang lowered his gaze. He turned, and the pack vanished into the storm. Theo collapsed in the mud, breathless, trembling. Mason didn't look at him, didn't speak. He simply stood there for a moment, watching the dark where the wolves had gone, then turned and began to walk away, his massive frame disappearing between the trees like a shadow returning to the mountain. Theo stared after him, and somehow through the haze of fear and cold and confusion, he knew he had only 2 choices: stay here and hope the wolves didn't return, or follow the one creature who had saved his life without a word. And so, paw trembling, heart pounding, he took a step forward, then another and another. The storm had not fully passed, but the rage of its heart had quieted. The trees still creaked, and the occasional gust sent pine needles cascading down like dry rain. But the thunder had softened into a distant grumble, like the mountain muttering in its sleep. The forest floor, soaked and shivering beneath the mist, reeked of damp bark, disturbed earth, and the heavy scent of bear. Theo's legs ached as he trudged behind the enormous shape ahead of him. Mason didn't speak. He moved like a glacier, steady, unavoidable, with a weight that demanded space be made. His silver-streaked coat rippled over his massive shoulders, and his steps sank deep into the soaked ground, leaving behind craters that swallowed Theo's tiny paws whole. He never once looked back. Theo followed not out of understanding or trust, but out of sheer instinct. He had no idea where his mother was. He had no idea what this old bear would do if he displeased him. But the image of the wolves, those glowing eyes, the silent circle of death, still burned in his mind. He couldn't stay there. He had to move. Mason was moving. That was enough. They passed a split cedar tree blackened from lightning and an uprooted stump that smelled faintly of wild garlic. Theo's ears twitched at every crackle of leaves, but the presence of Mason ahead quieted the panic building in his chest. Not because he felt safe. No, nothing about this hulking stranger felt safe, but because even fear seemed to think twice before approaching him. Then Mason spoke. "If you can't keep up, don't bother trying." His voice was low, rough like bark, split in winter. He didn't stop walking, didn't turn to see if Theo was listening. Theo blinked, stunned by the bluntness. I didn't ask to be here," he said, his voice small, barely more than a squeak in the thick fog. "No," Mason growled. "You asked to live." Theo fell silent. Elsewhere far below the slopes of Mount Ashmore, a small boot crunched into soft mud. 10-year-old Lila Carter, her sketchbook tucked under her left arm and a graphite pencil clenched between her teeth, crouched near a cluster of fresh tracks. She had auburn hair tied into a messy braid, freckles that spilled across her nose like confetti, and a pair of 2 big hiking boots she had borrowed from her dad's gear closet. Her jacket was several sizes too large, patched with cloth in the shape of tiny owls and stitched with the loving clumsiness of a child who tried to fix her own clothes when they tore. Lila had always been more curious than careful. The type of girl who watched ants for hours, who named birds from a distance, who once tried to make a friendship bracelet for a raccoon. Her mother had passed away when she was 5, and since then, her father, Dr. Thomas Carter, a forest ecologist with a gentle voice and worry lines etched around his eyes, had raised her, while working as the head researcher at the Ashmore Wildlife Observations cabin tucked just outside the forest's edge. He taught her how to read the forest, how to stay quiet, and above all else, how to notice what others ignored. And right now what she was noticing were bear tracks, 2 sets, one large, one small. She gently sat cross-legged in the mud, flipped open her sketchbook and began to draw. She didn't just sketch the paw prints, she added the size comparison, labeled them, circled the depth, and then with her pencil tapping lightly against her bottom lip, she wrote the words, "Not normal, too close together, one protecting." Back in the forest's upper paths, Mason finally stopped in a hollow between 2 boulders shielded on 3 sides by moss and overhanging branches. Water dripped rhythmically into a shallow puddle. Without a word, he sat. The earth seemed to sink beneath his weight. Theo paused on the edge of the clearing, uncertain. Mason turned his head, slowly locking eyes with him for the first time since they had begun walking. "You made it," he said, voice flat. Theo nodded, chest rising and falling fast. "Why did you help me?" Mason's eyes narrowed. "I was there. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." They sat in silence. Theo curled up near a rock, careful to keep a distance. His fur was still wet, clinging to his sides. He could feel the chill in his bones. Mason said nothing more. He didn't offer warmth nor comfort, but he didn't chase Theo away. And for now, that was enough. Down in the valley, Lila wiped the mud from her hands and followed the tracks. She wasn't reckless, just determined. She'd left her father a note like she always did and brought her whistle and a flashlight. Her feet crunched quietly through the underbrush as she traced the faint trail, noting claw marks on tree bark and a tuft of dark fur caught on a bramble. She paused beside a broken log that looked like something enormous had stepped over it. Then she saw something unusual, a heavy, sharp dent in the earth, too deep for a black bear. Her heart thumped. She reached down and pressed her fingers into the edge of the print. "Grizzly," she whispered, disbelieving. "Grizzlies weren't supposed to be here. Not in this part of the Appalachians." She flipped her sketchbook to a new page and began to draw again, pencil moving in quick, practiced strokes. The forest around her whispered with the hush of post-storm silence. She didn't know it yet, but she had just stepped into a story far older than she imagined, and it had already begun. The morning mist clung to the ground, like breath held too long. Shafts of pale sunlight filtered through the branches overhead, casting shimmering ribbons across the forest floor, as Mason stirred from his silent place beneath the overhang. The storm had passed, leaving the earth soggy and steaming, a quiet aftermath after the chaos. Theo awoke, slowly blinking against the hazy light, his small body stiff from the damp night. He stretched cautiously, every muscle sore, and found Mason already on his feet, nose to the wind. Without a word, the old grizzly started walking. Theo hesitated, then followed. He didn't know where they were going. Mason didn't explain. He never did. But something about the bear's stride told Theo. It mattered. They descended through a thick corridor of spruce and hemlock, the path narrow and slick with dew. The sound of running water grew stronger with each step, a steady rushing rhythm that stirred hunger in Theo's belly. His stomach growled, echoing slightly in the still woods. After nearly an hour of silent travel, they reached a bend in the land where a mountain river carved through the rocks, a wide, shallow place where the current tumbled over smooth stones and silver fish flickered just beneath the surface. Mist rose from the surface and the air was cold enough to make Theo shiver. Mason didn't speak. He simply trudged into the water, his massive paws churning the riverbed. Theo watched, unsure what to do. But when Mason stopped in the middle of the river and turned his head, he spoke with a voice like, "Gravel. Food doesn't find you. You find it. Go in." Theo stepped cautiously into the shallows. The water was shockingly cold, biting into his legs like icy claws. He gasped but didn't retreat. Mason watched him with unreadable eyes, then turned back to the water and raised one heavy paw. The strike was faster than Theo thought possible. A splash. A blur of motion. Then a large trout lay flopping on the bank. "Your turn," Mason said, and returned to the river's center. Theo gulped. The water was deeper than he expected. His legs weren't steady. He stared into the current, watching the darting shadows of fish, and tried to mimic Mason. He raised a paw, waited, then swung. Nothing, just a splash. The fish vanished like ghosts. He tried again and again. Every miss left him colder, more frustrated, more aware of how little he knew. Mason didn't mock him. He didn't help either. Occasionally, he'd glance over, say nothing, and return to his own fishing, catching a second trout with surgical ease. Theo's breath trembled, his paw ached, but his hunger pushed him. He planted himself deeper in the mud, stared into the river, and waited not with panic, but with attention. He watched the fish now, not just their movement, but their rhythm, their hesitation before darting forward. He began to feel the water instead of fight it. When the next fish passed close, Theo moved differently, slower, focused. This time he struck true. The fish landed hard against the rock. Theo pounced, holding it down with both paws, heart pounding. He looked up to see Mason watching him, still expressionless. Good. Mason grunted, now eat. Theo dragged his prize to the shore and tore into it messy and desperate. The flavor, raw and sharp, filled his mouth, and for the first time since the storm, he felt something warm inside. It wasn't just the food, it was survival. Meanwhile, down in the valley, Lila Carter knelt beside the base of an ash tree, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She had found something odd, tufts of fur snagged on a low branch, some black, some gray. Her hands trembled with excitement as she sketched her pencil, capturing the subtle differences in fiber. She glanced around to make sure her father wasn't near. He'd already scolded her for wandering too far. Yesterday, Dr. Thomas Carter was a quiet man in his early 40s, tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair cropped short, and a habit of running his fingers through his beard when deep in thought. He loved the forest, but feared its unpredictability. Since losing his wife, he had become more cautious, more protective, perhaps overly so. He never yelled, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen things disappear too quickly. Lila loved him dearly, but she couldn't help the pull of the wild. Today she'd slipped away early, following the trail from yesterday's sketches. The pattern of movement, she realized, was too precise for just one bear. The smaller tracks were still alongside the larger ones. Even here, they weren't parallel. They curved in and out, one followed the other, not separate, she murmured aloud. Together. She flipped to a clean page and began drawing a scene. Two bears, one, towering one, small by a river. It was speculative, but her gut told her it was true. From the woods, a hawk cried high overhead, and the wind rustled the canopy. She took that as her cue to pack up and return before her father noticed her absence. But she knew she would be back. Something about the trail, the feeling behind the prints, was calling to her. Back upriver, Theo finished his meal, licking the last flakes of fish from his paws. He sat in silence, chest heaving, unsure if the knot in his chest was hunger, fading, or pride swelling. Mason lumbered from the water, shook off droplets, and settled beside a large boulder. "You learn fast," he said at last. Theo's ears perked. "Does that mean I'm strong?" Mason glanced at him. "It means you're not dead." Theo huffed, but despite the bluntness, he felt something shift. A small ember had caught in his chest. A sense that maybe he could do this. The sun hadn't fully risen when Mason growled his first words of the day. "Get up." His voice, low and steady, rumbled through the quiet of the riverbank like distant thunder. Theo stirred, still curled near a moss-covered stone, his fur matted and stiff with morning dew. He blinked sleep from his eyes and stood slowly, bones aching from the cold night. The fire inside him, the spark lit by yesterday's success, had not gone out, but it flickered uncertainly in the face of Mason's commanding tone. Mason stood like a monolith, the silver streaks along his broad back, catching what little light filtered through the treetops. Without another word, he turned and began walking up a slope, slick with wet needles and loose earth. Theo followed, heart thudding. He didn't know where they were going, but Mason's silence usually meant something difficult was ahead. They reached a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their trunks marked with claw scars from long-forgotten battles. The ground here was soft, thick with churned mud and leaves ideal for absorbing impacts. Mason stopped in the center and turned to face the cub. "You want to stay alive," he said. "You learn to fight." Theo's eyes widened. "Fight. You're not big, you're not strong, but you're quick, and that's something. Use it." Mason lowered his massive body into a stance that was almost casual until he moved. With frightening speed, Mason swiped a paw toward Theo. It stopped inches from the cub's nose, but the wind it created made him flinch and stumble backward. "First lesson," Mason said, "flinching gets you killed." Theo swallowed hard and dug his claws into the earth. "I'm ready." "No, you're not." but you will be. And so, the lesson began. Mason didn't coddle, he didn't explain before striking. He lunged without warning, paw, low, then high, then low, again. Theo learned the rhythm of Mason's breath, the shift of his weight before a swipe. He dodged most, was clipped by others, and each time he fell into the mud, he got back up, covered in dirt. Pride bruised his breathing, ragged but standing. After what felt like hours, Mason finally stepped back. "You're learning," he said. Theo spat a leaf from his mouth. "I'm getting thrown around." Same thing. Meanwhile, in a valley thick with ferns and low brush, Lila Carter crouched beneath a large oak and peered at something smeared along the edge of a broken branch. It was red dark and drying. Her pulse quickened. She'd followed the trail farther than usual today, certain she was close to another big find. But this? She pulled out her sketchbook and carefully documented what she saw. A broken trail of disturbed moss claw marks in the bark and now blood. Her breath hitched. Did something get attacked? She whispered to herself. She flipped back through her sketches, prints, fur samples, the imagined scene by the river, and frowned. The pieces didn't add up to a violent fight. Not yet. But this new evidence unsettled her. Lila was brave, but not reckless. Her mother, a former wildlife photographer, had always told her that bravery wasn't about ignoring danger, it was about listening to your instincts and knowing when to act. She scanned the woods around her. All was quiet. Too quiet. She tucked her sketchbook under one arm and began the careful walk back toward the Carter cabin. Her father would be awake soon. She'd tell him most of it. Back in the clearing, Theo stood panting, fur caked with mud and bruises blooming beneath his skin. Mason approached slowly and nudged him upright with a paw. Again the older bear said. Theo glared, but he stepped back into position. "I thought you said I was learning. I did, and now you learn more." This time, Theo struck first. He lunged not wildly, but with focus. Mason didn't swat him aside like before. He parried, letting Theo's momentum carry him past. Theo recovered, quickly turned, ducked a paw, then tried again. They circled each other. It wasn't a fight, not really, it was a dance. And Mason was teaching him the steps. As they trained, the light in the forest shifted. The morning matured, the wind picked up, and in the distance a hawk cried out across the valley. Mason lowered his paw after a final exchange and motioned for Theo to sit. "Why are you helping me?" Theo asked. Chest heaving, Mason didn't answer at first. He looked to the trees, his expression unreadable. Finally he said, "Because someone once helped me." Theo blinked, who Mason didn't respond. The silence that followed felt final. Theo looked down at his muddy paws, then back at Mason. "I'll be stronger," he said. Mason didn't nod, didn't smile, but he didn't argue. It was the closest thing to approval Theo had ever heard. The afternoon light faded through the canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor as the wind stilled. The air turned heavy, still not with peace, but with the breath of something waiting. Theo stood at the edge of a shallow glade, his legs sore from the days of training, his chest rising and falling in silence. Beside him, Mason emerged from the trees, his shoulders set, his eyes dark and unmoving. He didn't speak at first, but Theo felt it in the older bear's posture. Something was wrong. Then Mason said, it flat and cold, "They're back." Theo didn't ask who, he already knew. "They're not here to scare us this time." Mason added, "They've come to finish it." Theo felt his claws dig into the dirt. His heart raced, but he didn't move. Not away, not back, not anymore. "I'm not running," he said. Mason didn't nod, he didn't speak again. But the look in his eyes said, he heard. Up on the slope above the clearing, Lila Carter lay on her stomach behind a mossy log, her binoculars pressed to her face. She'd followed the tracks further than ever before, hoping to catch a glimpse of the two bears she had drawn again and again in her sketchbook. But now what she saw made her blood turn cold. Wolves, at least 7, maybe more, were fanning out along the edge of the glade. Their movements were precise, purposeful, not exploratory like before. And at their center was a larger wolf, his gray coat marred by an old scar down his muzzle. They were hunting. This wasn't a patrol, and the bears were surrounded. Lila's hands trembled as she lowered the binoculars. Her breath came short and panicked. Her heart told her to run. Her feet had already begun to move. She turned, clutching the binoculars tight, and scrambled back through the underbrush, snapping twigs beneath her boots as she made for the slope and the trail below. "I have to tell Dad," she whispered more to herself than anyone. Behind her in the forest clearing, the wind began to move again, not in breeze but in the breath of something inevitable. The clearing beneath the towering oaks pulsed with tension, the air thick and unmoving like the stillness before a storm. Above the ancient limbs creaked softly golden leaves trembling against the last breath of wind. Below, Mason stood unmoving, a mountain of gray fur and scarred muscle. Beside him, Theo's heart pounded against his ribs, but he didn't flinch. Not this time. The wolves had closed in 8 of them, in total sleek and silent eyes gleaming with hunger and intent. They circled slowly, fanning out to cut off escape, though neither bear made a move to flee. At the center of the formation, Fang emerged from the brush like smoke given form. His fur was darker than before, matted with rain and time, and his amber eyes held no fear. Only calculation. Fang's voice came low. "Oily. I warned you." Mason didn't answer. He crouched slightly, shoulders rolling forward, a low growl starting in his chest, slow and deep. Without further warning, the forest erupted into chaos. Mason moved first. He charged with the force of a falling boulder, roaring as he struck the nearest wolf with a paw so powerful it sent the creature spinning through the underbrush. The rest of the pack sprang into action, but Mason was faster than he looked. He pivoted, barreled into 2 more, his massive frame scattering them like dry leaves in wind. Theo didn't wait for orders. His body, smaller and faster, slipped between trunks and roots as he zeroed in on his target, Fang. The old fear still scratched at the back of his mind, but he pushed it down. Mason was battling the pack. Theo had only one enemy. Fang spotted him and turned just as Theo lunged, claws outstretched. The wolf ducked, twisted, countered, but Theo had learned more than movement. He had learned how to watch. He anticipated Fang's pivot, dropped low, and raked his claws across the wolf's flank. Not deep, but enough. Fang snarled, spun, and snapped his jaws toward Theo's throat. Theo jumped back, breath ragged. Blood stained Fang's fur. A flicker of surprise crossed the wolf's face. Surprise that this cub hadn't run, that he had drawn blood. Then rage replaced it. Fang lunged back in Ashmore Hollow. The Carter cabin sat quiet, tucked behind a split-rail fence and a garden of overgrown mint. Inside, Doctor. Thomas Carter stared in stunned silence as Lila tried to catch her breath between frantic bursts of explanation. Her face was flushed, eyes wide, hands trembling. There were so many, Dad, and the little bear was fighting. He was really fighting. Dr. Carter, a man of calm nerves and careful words, was tall, trim, with thoughtful gray eyes, and the kind of hands that had spent years documenting tracks, not holding weapons. But as Lila's voice cracked, something in his face hardened. He grabbed his field pack from the hallway. "You stay here. You lock the door. I'll take the ridge trail." Lila looked up frightened. "What if something happens to you?" He paused at the door, turned and gave her a steady look. "I won't let it." Then he was gone, hiking boots, pounding the dry path beyond the porch. Back beneath the oaks, the battle twisted and tangled in bursts of fur. Fang and roar. Mason now bled from a long scratch along his shoulder, but gave no sign of slowing. One wolf tried to leap on his back. Mason twisted mid-swing and slammed it against a tree trunk, knocking the wind from its lungs. Theo ducked another bite from Fang, narrowly avoiding his snapping jaws. His breath came short. He was faster, but Fang was brutal and experienced. Theo couldn't beat him head-on, so he changed tactics. He feinted right, then veered left, darted beneath a fallen log, and doubled back. Fang followed, but too quickly. Theo turned and leapt, ramming shoulder first into Fang's chest with a grunt. The wolf stumbled. That was the moment Theo slashed. This time, the wound opened across Fang's snout, right through the old scar. Fang cried out, staggered back, blood dripping onto the leaf-covered soil. Everything stopped. The other wolves froze, Mason panting heavily. Stood over 2 downed attackers. His chest rose and fell like the swell of a distant sea. The wind returned to the clearing in a soft gust, shaking leaves loose from the canopy above. Theo stood firm chest, heaving blood on his claws. Fang looked at him, and for the first time, his eyes didn't burn with fury. They flickered with something like recognition, or perhaps shame. With a growl, Fang turned. He didn't howl, he didn't speak. He simply walked away. The others followed one by one into the shadows. Mason didn't chase them. Neither did Theo. They watched as silence returned, this time earned. Mason finally looked down at Theo, not speaking, not smiling, but no longer distant. And Theo, covered in mud and trembling with adrenaline, said, "Only, I didn't run." Mason gave a slow nod. "No, you didn't." The forest had returned to quiet, but not the same kind of quiet it had before. This silence was deeper, more reverent, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, in respect for something sacred that had just occurred beneath their canopy. Leaves still fluttered from above, where they had been shaken loose during the fight, drifting slowly to the blood-speckled ground, where paw prints of battle remained. Lila Carter stood at the edge of the clearing. She had returned just after sunrise, long after the wolves had disappeared into the shadows, and the bears had vanished into the deeper woods. She had ignored her father's warnings, slipped out while he was preparing gear in the back barn, and followed the same path she had run down the day before. Her hands clutched her sketchbook tightly against her chest, and a pencil already dulled at the tip was tucked behind her ear. Her brown boots sank slightly into the soft soil as she stepped carefully over snapped branches and clawed up earth. The scene was quiet now, but she could feel it. The fight had happened here. Claw marks carved into the trunk of an old oak, a streak of dried blood on a stone, the imprint of large paws, one massive, the other smaller but firm. She slowly sat down on a flat patch of moss and opened her sketchbook. Her breath came slowly, evenly now. With every flick of her pencil, the chaos began to form into something clear, something ordered. She started with Mason, his towering frame, the way his fur rippled like storm clouds in motion, the way he moved like the forest had shaped him from stone and tree. Then she drew Theo, not cowering behind Mason, but beside him, chest forward, claws dug into the ground, eyes full of resolve. She shaded the clearing around them, a swirl of wolves in retreat behind the leaves. She didn't need to draw every fang or every slash. What mattered was the stance, the feeling. It was a memory, but also a promise. When she finished, she looked at it for a long time. Then she flipped the book closed, stood up and walked to a nearby boulder, one nestled in the crook of two roots at the clearing's edge, smooth-faced and half-covered in moss. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out her pocket knife. The blade was small and dull, used mostly for whittling, but it worked. Slowly, carefully, she carved the outline of the drawing into the stone. Not all of it, just the shapes, Mason, Theo, side by side. She worked in silence, the forest watching. When she was done, she pressed her palm to the carving. "I won't tell anyone," she whispered. "I promise. Somewhere deeper in the forest." Theo was walking alongside Mason in silence. His legs ached and one of his ears was still sore where a wolf's tooth had grazed it, but he held his head high. They hadn't spoken since the fight, but Theo could feel something different in the space between them. Mason didn't lead far ahead anymore. He walked with him, not in front of him. The river they passed shimmered in the morning light, its current calm. A few birds chirped tentatively in the branches above, as if testing whether the storm had truly passed. Mason stopped beside a fallen log and sniffed the air. Someone was here, he said, his voice low. Theo stepped beside him. "And the wolves." Mason shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." Theo followed Mason's gaze. There, near the base of a tree, was a set of boot prints, small, deliberate, and beside them a rough carving in a stone freshly etched. Theo moved closer. His heart skipped. It was them, him and Mason, standing together. He blinked. Mason stared at it a long time, then muttered, "So?" She was watching. Theo glanced up. "Should we be worried?" Mason shook his head. Once, then turned. "No. If she wanted to harm us, she would have brought others. This is something else." They moved on, but not with haste. For the first time in days, the forest around them felt less like a cage and more like a home. Back at the Carter cabin, Lila had returned before her father noticed. She slid her sketchbook under her bed, still dusty from her morning walk, and opened her window just slightly to let in the breeze. She sat at her desk, staring out at the edge of the woods, with a look that had changed since yesterday. Not just wonder now, but quiet reverence. Her father, Dr. Thomas Carter, entered the room a few minutes later. He was still in his field vest, clipboard in hand, eyes tired from a night of worrying. "I'm heading back up to the ridge. Later," he said, "want to come." Lila smiled faintly. "Maybe tomorrow." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it. "All right, just stay close." She nodded, "I will." But her eyes returned to the trees. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. The seasons changed slowly in Ashmore Hollow, like the hands of an old clock that ticked only when no one was watching. Spring washed the mountains in rain, and green summer brought buzzing cicadas and gold-streaked skies. And now, 1 year since the battle beneath the oaks, autumn had returned crisp and full of quiet memory. A trail wound along the ridge above the Carter property, old and rarely used, carved out by deer hooves and the occasional boot. From there, the town of Ashmore Hollow looked like a toy village nestled among the trees, its smoke spiraling from chimneys and its streets glowing in the amber haze of October light. In the woods above, Theo stood on a granite outcrop now taller and broader than he had been. His coat had thickened to a dark chestnut, glossy beneath the sun, and his posture held the calm steadiness of someone who had chosen his path and walked it with purpose. He looked out over the forest, not searching, but watching. Beside him, Mason moved with the slow strength of age and mastery. His gray-streaked fur blended into the rocks and roots, and though a limp had settled into his left shoulder, where an old injury had never fully healed, his presence remained vast. They didn't speak often now. They didn't need to. They had become something more than teacher and student sentinels of the woods, keepers of an unspoken rhythm. Theo had stopped asking about his mother months ago, not because he stopped caring, but because something else had grown in place of the ache, a sense of belonging. The forest hadn't given him back what he lost. It had given him something new, far below in the center of town. The old fire station had been transformed for a single weekend into something altogether different. Its garage doors were flung open, and inside hung rows of sketches, watercolors, and charcoal renderings. The space smelled of sawdust graphite and cinnamon cider. A hand-painted sign out front read, "Shadow of the Ridge, an exhibition by Lila Carter." Lila, now 11, stood in the middle of the room with ink-stained fingers and a cardigan tied around her waist. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy braid, and her boots still bore dust from a pre-dawn hike that morning. Her father, Dr. Thomas Carter, manned a folding table near the entrance, wearing a tweed jacket over a field vest, and trying not to hover as guests milled about. They were locals, mostly rangers, teachers, a few retirees from the edges of town, but each moved slowly between the drawings, pausing for long moments before certain images. Near the back, partially lit by a shaft of sun that slipped through a crack in the door, was a frame smaller than the rest. Inside it, a pencil drawing in soft contrast. A young bear standing beside a massive grizzly. The young one was slightly forward, alert, and proud. The large one behind him was still steady, watching the horizon. No title, no date. Only a small note handwritten at the bottom corner. They don't need to be seen to be known. Lila stood a few paces away, her hands behind her back, watching the townsfolk pause, tilt their heads, move on quietly. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sarah Mackey, a retired art teacher in her early 60s, with a lean frame and short white blonde hair tucked under a felt hat, approached the sketch. Sarah had lived in Ashmore Hollow for most of her life. She was the kind of woman who offered hard truths with soft eyes, and who always wore 2 silver rings on her right hand, one for her late husband and one for her son, who never came home from deployment. Her voice was low and warm when she spoke. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked without turning. Lila didn't answer immediately. She looked at Sarah's face at the gentle smile behind the knowing expression. "I did," she said, "but they didn't know I was watching at first." "And now?" Sarah asked. Lila smiled softly. "Now they let me." Sarah nodded once, then moved on. Outside, the breeze picked up, sending a swirl of yellow leaves spinning through the street. In the woods, Theo padded softly behind Mason along a trail that circled back to the eastern bluff. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. From here, Theo could see the far-off rooftops of town, could hear the faintest sounds of a community moving below. He didn't envy it. He didn't miss it. He only watched. And as he settled beside Mason, lowering himself onto a bed of moss beneath a tall oak, he felt it again, that same deep pull in his chest, not of longing, but of place, of being where he was meant to be. Not just alive, but home. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come with thunder or fire. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet decision, a trembling cub choosing not to run a stranger, offering strength without words, a child, keeping a promise to protect what she cannot explain. In the silence of the forest, in the shadows of those who choose to watch over others rather than be seen, we find the true shape of grace. This story reminds us that God often works through the unexpected. A child, a beast, a scarred guardian, Each was part of something bigger. Each was chosen not because they were the strongest, but because they chose to stand when it mattered most. In our own lives, we too are given moments to choose to fear or to trust, to run or to rise, to stay silent or to speak life into someone else's darkness. When we feel alone, when we think we are too small to matter, remember this. Even the quietest heart can carry the voice of heaven. If this story touched your soul, share it with someone who needs reminding that they are not forgotten. Leave a comment below and tell us what moment in your life felt like your mountain. Subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and second chances. And if you believe that God still sends us guides, still works through storms and silence alike, comment Amen, and may He bless you with strength, peace, and purpose in the journey ahead.